This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider telling someone about the podcast, especially if you've been impacted by the stories you've heard. Someone out there that you know who's in the middle of deconstruction or they're feeling alone after deconversion. Let them know about the podcast. Tell them about your favorite episode. That will really help the podcast grow. As always, please consider joining the Deconversion Anonymous Facebook group. That is at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. And our ongoing Tuesday evening hangout that happens after the episode drops, hosted by our community manager, Arlene. Tuesday evenings at 5:30 Pacific, 8:30 Eastern. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. My guest today is Paul. Paul is Deb's husband. She was on the previous episode. And Paul and Deb married as high school sweethearts, and they went into the mission field very early in their early 20s and stayed in the mission field for decades. They were in Africa. They did missionary training in Switzerland. And when they came back to the United States, Paul became a visitation pastor. He was also seeking his ordination, and when the church rejected his ordination, things began to unravel. To add insult to injury, Paul was also let go of that position, and he ultimately became a bus driver, which he greatly enjoyed. But being outside of the context of church, he began to have deep and difficult questions. Here is Paul to tell his story. Paul, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
It's great to be here with you. I'm looking forward to it.
So we got to talk to your wife, Deb, recently. And in fact, I think that her episode will be released immediately before yours. So we're going to get a different perspective on similar life story. And I'm excited to hear that. So we're just going to begin where we always do. Like, what was your faith tradition growing up?
Okay. Well, I was born almost 71 years ago. So in 1951, during the Korean War, it was shortly after the end of the World War II and just a few years, 11 years before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so there was in the country that was going on at that time was a lot of fear and concern about the international scene and about communism in particular. And in our school, and I went to a little Christian school, and we did have drills that took us down to the basement. But I don't really remember being afraid, even as a child. I don't remember being afraid of the soldiers coming or being of the communists. But one thing I do remember being afraid of was that if the communists actually came, I wouldn't be brave enough to actually admit that I was Christian. Because, we that was in our culture, that was being, telling a lie wasn't an option. When they came to the door and said, "Are you a Christian?" If you were, you should say you are, and no matter the cost. Being a martyr was seen as being a very good thing to do. And I wasn't quite sure I'd be up for that. And of course, we didn't have guns in our house, so shooting the communists wasn't an option either. So that was just, an interesting, as I thought about my heritage and the emphasis in my early years, that was one of the little odd things.
And you make a good point here, Paul, that martyrdom is baked into a lot of Christianity, and particularly evangelical Christianity, and that it is pushed even on children.
Yes,
that you have to stand up for your faith, and if you're not standing up for your faith, you're doing it wrong.
Exactly. Yeah. My parents were focused on building God's kingdom. They were very devoted. The songs we sang in our Sunday school and at home were songs like "This world is not my home. I'm just passing through."
Mm-hmm.
And, when we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. So there was a focus on the afterlife, and not a lot of focus on this life as far as it being a world that was worth being too concerned about. I'd say my religious heritage was they emphasized being born again,
Hmm.
being separated. By separated, I mean the verse, come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing. Uh, it was all King James Version. Uh, and Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. The Bible was very, very important. All scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable, and those kinds of verses. Um, now, it was interesting that I remember going to an Oliver Green concert when I was a child. My dad and mom took me there, and he was railing against the Revised Standard Version of the Bible.
Okay.
Just, I'm talking now about the importance of the King James Version of the Bible. And I remember this, and he said, now in the Bible it says that Jesus said, "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you." But he says in the revised, which he called the reversed standard version, the
Yes.
reversed standard version, it says, "In my Father's house are many rooms," instead of mansions. Now, which would you rather have, a mansion or a room? And he was making a point of the superiority of the King James Version based on what people would want to hear,
Right. Right.
rather than what the Greek word actually.
Exactly. Yes.
And even as a young person, it rattled me a little bit. I just wondered about that. I never forgot it. In my heritage, Christian heritage, the attitude toward higher education was fairly negative, because if you went to an Ivy League school or a university, you may lose your faith by
Mm.
going there, because you're being taught, of things about evolution, or running into, characters that would influence you against the Lord. So that was another factor. My father was the director of a children's Bible camp, and all around the camp, they had verses tacked to trees or written on boards. And even the tabernacle, there was exposed beams in the tabernacle there. And I remember sitting in that tabernacle and looking at one of these verses. And one of the ones I remember specifically was 1 Corinthians 8:1. Knowledge puffeth up, but love buildeth up.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a contrast between knowledge and love.
Yeah.
And I grew up in a Christianity that thought and believed that they had love, God's love, and that was superior to knowledge. So that's a little bit about my heritage. As I said, the Bible was the foundation of every belief and action. It informed the entire worldview of my religious family. Uh, our pastor had a dispensational chart that was on a big sheet that he put across the front of the church. It was up there most of the time, and that described the age of innocence, the age of law, the age of grace, the church. Then it had the rapture, and it had the tribulation period, and it had heaven. We knew where we were on that chart. We were just at the point of the rapture. That was where that's where my heritage was. And we would sing songs like coming again, maybe morning, maybe noon, maybe evening, and maybe soon. And we were taught to expect and be ready for the rapture at any moment. And the Bible was seen kind of as a supernatural book that had almost magical qualities. It was handwritten by God, and the
Mm.
writers they had very little to do with the wording in the Bible. Uh, they played a very compliant role. Um, now, I have an older brother and a younger sister. My brother is a pastor, and he has been a pastor for over 50 years in the same church. recently he and I had lunch. Now we used to have a lot in common before my deconversion.
Okay. All right.
Uh, we would meet for lunch almost every other week or so. He lives in the same town I live in now, and so but we hadn't been together for quite some time. And he called me up and he asked if we could have lunch. So I said, sure, I'd be glad to. So and he's kind of aware of my journey, my spiritual journey, the uh, away from evangelicalism.
Right.
So I wasn't sure exactly, what he would say or what he had on, but it was very congenial. And but at the very end of our, he says, listen, he said, I don't want to preach at you, but I do want to ask you uh, one question. He says, can I look forward to seeing you in heaven someday? Was his question really.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, I don't think so. I said, because I no longer believe in heaven or hell. And I said, I don't think of that there's a geographical place up in the sky where there are streets of gold and mansions, and that where there's a physical place where we go after we die. And so I said, I really can't say yes to answer your question. I
Yeah.
don't think so. And I said, that doesn't mean I don't believe in an afterlife of some kind. I said, I just don't see it that way anymore. And I said, there may be, and I may have consciousness, in some form um, and so he said, well, he said, okay. He said, just let me ask you this though. Then as a result of that, he said, just promise me that you'll read the gospels.
Yeah.
I thought that's kind of a strange ask. As if I hadn't ever read the gospel
Right. Right.
hundreds of times.
Yeah.
And, but I agreed with him. And I thought, now why would he, afterwards, I thought, why would he ask me that? Well, it's because he believes that the Bible has power, a magical power. And if I just read it at the right time, the Holy Spirit could take that and impress on my mind and perhaps bring me back to the fold.
Yeah.
And just as an illustration, I think of the attitude toward the Bible. Christian education was a strong emphasis in my background. My parents, they started a Christian school back in 1954. It was kind of at the beginning of the Christian school movement.
Okay.
And we had this small Christian school, started out in grades 1 to 4, and then uh, two grades in one class and two grades in an adjoining room. And it was small, probably only 6 or 8 kids in each class. Um, but the goal of the school was to teach Christian education. Once again, sort of the fear that uh, public education was, going to be teaching the wrong things. Going to be teaching, uh, they're going to, public education was probably going to be teaching about Darwinism, evolution, and maybe sex
Oh
education,
dear. Yeah.
and maybe of that nature. So we want to protect our children, give them a good Bible-based education. And so we start out the classes with the Pledge of Allegiance to the Bible, Pledge of Allegiance to the Christian flag, Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and then go on from there with our Bible classes and then arithmetic and reading and the rest of it.
Yeah.
The family I grew up in was particularly devoted. Uh, my father, as I mentioned, was a full-time Christian worker. He didn't get money from a secular job. It was very important to him that that people, if they're going to serve the Lord, they serve Him completely. And uh, secular workers weren't looked down on; they were appreciated for being able to support with their finances the Christian work. So the message I heard was that, well, if you're going to be anybody, you're going to be a Christian worker. And my brother and my sister and I all turned out to be Christian workers. Uh, and that was the message I heard everywhere I turned, in school, in church, Good News Club, Youth for Christ rallies. It was always a two-pronged message: be saved and get other people saved, and also dedicate your life to the Lord for His purposes. And the most important thing, of course, was salvation. And I'd say I got saved when I was 5 years old on Christmas Day. Uh, we always had big Christmases in our house, and we'd gotten a seesaw, a small seesaw that we were playing on, and my sister was in one seat and my brother was on the other. I was kind of on the middle with this little seesaw, and I wanted to be on the end, and I pushed my sister off and got yeah. And so my father, he took me upstairs. I thought I was going to get a spanking, but he said, Paulie, he said, let me tell you the reason why you did that. The reason you did that is because you need to have Jesus in your heart. If you
Okay.
uh, receive Jesus, and ask the Lord to forgive you for your sins. And he explained to me, in simple words as he could find. And that's when I prayed to receive Jesus. And I was 5. So just gives you an idea of that kind of the background, my religious heritage. My attitude as a child, as a young person, being in this environment all this time was, I'd say, one of acceptance. And I didn't rebel. I didn't rebel against it. Uh, I wanted to please. I wanted to please my parents. I wanted to please my teachers. I wanted to be successful. Uh, so I bought in.
And internally, what was that like for you? Did you feel like you were going through the motions because that was what was expected of you, or was it self motivating?
No, I think it was sincere.
Yeah.
I sincerely believed it. I believed in the rapture, and I believed in hell, and I believed that it was important to follow Jesus. And I rededicated my life probably 5 or 6 times along the way. I can still remember the pledge in one of those. When I went forward in the tabernacle there at the camp, and they hand out these pledge cards, and it was a pledge card that had been written originally by John and Betty Stam, missionaries with the China Inland Mission back
Okay.
in 1934. They were beheaded by the communist Chinese communists soldiers. And it was, Lord, I give up all my own plans and purposes, all my own desires and hopes, and accept thy will for my life. I give myself, my life, my all, utterly to thee to be thine forever. Fill me with your Holy Spirit. Use me as thou wilt. Send me where thou wilt. Work out thy whole will in my life at any cost, both now and forever. And that was the pledge. And I meant it. I was ready to rock and roll, whatever God wanted me to do.
Yeah.
I assumed he would help me, and I'd do it. But I was also interested in aviation. So I had a friend in high school who was learning to fly. Now, my parents weren't rich, but back then you didn't have to be rich to learn to fly. I mean, my flight lessons uh, while I was in high school were only $12 an hour. And so I got a job during high school, worked at a library during the week, and then on the weekend I went and took a flying lesson. And I got my private pilot's license while I was still in high school. And I did this all with the motive of being a missionary pilot. You're going to work overseas, fly missionaries around, work in remote places, work in a different language in an exotic place. And it's going to help missionaries and help people find Jesus.
Yeah.
Like, what could be more important than that? That was kind of the way I looked at life. Um, well, my my father, he was a Christian camp director, as I mentioned, and he was ordained. And he worked for Home Missionary Partners, which was an organization where he would go to hospitals and jails and alcoholics that were struggling with
Hmm.
alcoholism. And my mom was working as a secretary, business manager, and receptionist at the Bible camp, and also the Hide the Word contest. She ran that. That was a program where kids that were going to come to camp could get money by learning Bible verses. And pay against their camp tuition. And so I learned hundreds of Bible verses through this hide the word contest. Even though we were directors' kids in our family, we still had to learn the verses.
Yeah.
So I learned them all in the King James version of the Bible. Also, in our church, there was a parade of missionaries coming through. Every fourth Sunday was Missionary Lord's Day. Missionary would come and preach in the morning. He would teach the high school class. He would uh, talk to the youth group in the evening, he or she, and show missionaries, show slides in the service. And so I was getting a constant exposure to this career path. So I thought, well, missionary aviation sounds like it's my best shot. So that's what I did. But even back then, and now this is quite a long time ago. There was some, I would call them early signs of stormy weather ahead.
Yes. Something on the horizon. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of them was my father thought that if I was going to be a missionary, I should get ordained. He said he could arrange for that. He could arrange pastor friends of his. They could get a council together, and I could be ordained. So I said, okay, that sounds good to me. So he gave me a list of questions to write down my responses. So one of the questions was about divorce.
Hmm.
So I looked in the Bible and I wrote down a short paragraph about when it's okay or when God would allow uh, people to divorce. And one of those was you could divorce if there was marital unfaithfulness
Hmm.
or sexual impurity, Matthew 19:9. And also, there's another verse in 1 Corinthians talks about if the unbelieving spouse departs, let him depart. You won't be, uh, you're not bound
Right.
by. So I wrote the answers to this, and so I showed my answers to my dad. He was asking me, "How's it going on your preparations for your council?" I said, "Well, here's some of the things that I've." So he wrote he read down through the list of questions, and he got to this divorce part. And then he says, "Well," he says, "I know that's what the Bible says, but," he says, "you really can't say that in your council."
Okay. Yeah.
So I said, "Okay, well, I think I'll just set this aside then." And I just basically, I decided I wasn't going to get ordained if I couldn't say what the Bible said. If I had to start lining up with what this council wanted to hear,
Right.
was I look at that as being just a little bit of a early warning.
Hindsight for sure is 2020. Like when we look back, we can see the mileposts where, it wasn't at the time, it wouldn't have shaken our faith entirely, but it's something that is just one more brick on your back, weighing you down as you go through your life. And that sounds like one of the first ones for you. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. It was an early one. I married my childhood sweetheart. She graduated from Columbia Bible College. We went to Niamey, Niger in 1975 uh, with Sudan Interior Mission. It was called that back in those days.
Okay.
Um, and as we flew over the ocean on our first trip away, I looked over at her and I could see tears in her eyes.
Hmm.
She was, and I realized, she's not very happy to be gone
Mm.
over there. Uh, I was thrilled to be going. I couldn't wait to get there. To get onto that airplane. And fly over that desert and do that exciting, important work. But she was anticipating, missing her family. She was the oldest of five kids. She'd come from a very loving family, and so I realized this is costing her more than it's costing me. Um, well, anyway, we were there for in West Africa with SIM for 6 years, and then we had two children born there, and then the aviation program phased out, and so I was still young and excited about flying, and so I joined a different organization that had airplanes, Wycliffe Bible Translators,
Okay.
and we went we went to back to Cameroon in West Africa, and we were there for 15 years. Um, and I was flying up until 1991.
Wow.
And then,
That's a long time.
yeah, yeah, it was. And I have, a lot of stories I could tell about aviation. I enjoyed my work, but then the general director in Cameroon asked if Deb and I would be willing to be directors of the Africa Orientation Program to help new missionaries coming in to adapt and learn to love living in Africa. So we did that then for 4 years. Then they asked me if I would become the personnel director of the work in Cameroon. There were about 200 adult missionaries in Cameroon with Wycliffe at that time,
Okay.
and they were from Europe and America and Canada mostly. And so I became personnel director, and then eventually they voted for me to be the general director of all of the work in Cameroon. That was kind of in a snapshot, that was our missionary life, and over a period of 25 years.
Yeah, that's nothing to sneeze at. That's a long career.
There were some more dark clouds, I would say, that were coming along. Um, One of them happened really on our first furlough, coming back to the States. We left Nigeria and came back at Christmas time, and our home church was having a showing of a movie at their New Year's Eve service called The Burning Hell.
Mm.
It was a depiction of people actually burning in hell.
Wow.
Um, And so, late at night, we're in the service there, and I'm watching this movie. And then midnight is approaching, and so at midnight in the New Year's Eve service, they always get down on their knees in the pews and pray the new year in. That's the way they would say it. So we'd seen the movie, got down on our knees for a few minutes, and then New Year's came, and then the pastor, uh, we all got up, back up on the pews. And he says, okay, he said, now we're going to go downstairs and have refreshments. And we're going to have, cake and ice cream and lemonade. And he says, I see we have one of our missionaries home with us. So he said, Paul, welcome to the service. And he says, why don't you come up here and say the blessing on the refreshments?
Mm-hmm.
I'm still thinking about the hell, the
Yeah.
people burning in hell. My appetite's gone.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about Nigerian, and the mosques and the thousands of Muslims that are kneeling, and how can, what kind of people are these I'm here with? Do they really even believe what they just saw? How real is this?
That is such an important point. I say this all the time. It's not that Christians take things too seriously, it's that they don't take them seriously enough. If you truly believe that the people who have not heard the gospel are going to hell, that changes the way you live your life for every second of every day. And you've nailed it on the head here, that to just trivially go from, oh yeah, people are burning in hell, to, all right, cake and ice cream is quite a transition.
It hit me in a way. I think of the visual presentation that we just watched. I mean, it's one thing to think you believe something in a theoretical sense, a doctrine of the Bible or something. But when you see it on a screen, or when you get to know a Muslim person who's very, very kind and gracious, maybe more gracious than most Christians, uh, it hits you. It hit me anyway.
Yeah.
And So that was, I'd say, another dark cloud that came along. And then my experiences in Africa, the way I observed my neighbors and the African people, they're they're gracious and happy people.
Yeah.
They have a tough life, a rough life that I could tell you about in detail. Uh, but in spite of that, in spite of the inconvenience of their lives and the dangers and the poverty, they laugh and sing and get together and welcome strangers into their homes.
Yeah.
And it made me really wonder, do I have anything to offer these people?
Mm.
These people are happier than most Americans that I know. And so that was just another, I would say, sort of a conflict within myself as far as me going over there to be there, sort of to give them the good news when they seem to be doing pretty well under circumstances that would probably drive me and many Americans under the ground. So that's another dark cloud, probably, I would say. The other thing was the drinking of alcohol. I had grown up in a teetotaler uh, culture, and I had heard people preach and say the wine that Jesus made wasn't alcoholic because
Right.
it was 20 minutes old. Water 1 minute and wine the next. There's no alcohol. There's no fermentation here. But and then there was the belief that, well, anybody could become an alcoholic. You never know. You better be careful, because if you even take a sip of it, you can become addicted and
Mm.
become an alcoholic.
Yeah, yeah.
And then at a certain stage of our missionary life, we were in Switzerland learning French, and we were welcomed into this little church there. Very, very gracious people. And we had little kids. Our youngest was 9 months, and our oldest at that point was 7. We had a 5-year-old, really cute little kids. They fell in love with us, mostly the kids, and they welcomed us into their homes. They took us, around, and everywhere we went, they offered us wine to drink,
Right.
at every meal. And right off the bat, from almost day one, my question was, am I going to be sociable and learn this language? Or am I going to say, oh, nope, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to drink. And well, what would Jesus do? Well, you know, all things are permissible,
Right.
and
Right.
this one. So I abandoned that strong prohibition pretty early on. That's a little bit about my missionary background. Now, there was a pastoral chapter. Then we came back from Africa, and I was invited on staff at a large church, and I became the visitation pastor there, and I enjoyed that work very, very much. We came back because, well, our kids were transitioning into colleges and universities, and my wife wasn't going to be in Africa when our kids were transitioning over here. And if it had been just my decision, probably I would have, what that I would have probably tarried longer in Africa. But I could see her point, and and I was concerned too about our kids' adaptation to
Sure.
America. So I took up this job in this church, and as a result of my pastoral ministry here, I became I became part of the ministerium in Hershey, uh, where I was rubbing shoulders with pastors from Catholic Church and Presbyterian Church, Methodist Church, Seventh Day Adventist Church. Any pastoral clergy was welcome at the ministerium.
Right.
I really came to appreciate all of those individuals, men and women, and I there was no competition on our church staff for who was going to do this job. Um, the guy that had been doing it had in our church had family problems and had to step down, and so we had a staff meeting, and they said, "Who would like to do this?" And I raised my hand. I said, "I'd love to do this." Nobody, nobody else wanted to.
I find it really ironic that a little bit of ecumenicalism, to actually reach out to other denominations and sects of Christianity, that can be so polarizing for people. It amazes me.
Yeah, yeah, I was amazed, and so I came to appreciate these people, and it helped me to have a much wider appreciation for the Church of God, for
Mhm.
the community of saints, which I was seeing was bigger than just my little clan. So there were some cracks in my theological foundation that were starting to show now, as a result of some of my experiences in the pastorate. One of them, I was visiting a young girl in the hospital. She was 12, and I was asked to go see her. She was having some problems with eating disorder.
Mhm.
And so I didn't really know her personally. And it was a large church. There was several thousand people in this church that, so I went and introduced myself to her. And I was asking her how she's doing. And she said she's doing fine. And I asked her if she was saved. I said, "Are you saved?" And she said, "Well, I hope so." And so I said, "Did you ever ask Jesus into your heart?" And she said, "Oh, yes, I did that." I said, well, then you're saved. I said, because, in John it says, Jesus said, he said, "Whoever comes to me, I will in no wise cast down." And then she said this to me, which just almost shocked me what she said. And it's shocking, really, because it's so simple and it's something I hadn't really thought that much about before. She said, "I hope I meant it."
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And so for the first time, I think, I thought, well, how much do you have to mean it
Yeah.
in order for it to matter? Isn't it true that just about everything we do is with mixed motives? Anyway, many things we do for the wrong reasons. And so how much do we have to mean it? And so I'll never forget that conversation, and how that really raised a bar for me as far as thinking about the way we think about becoming a Christian. You pray this prayer, say you're sorry for your sins, and then you're transformed from non-believer to believer, from hell to heaven. And so that was I would say. And then I was visiting this Catholic man who was the father of one of our parishioners, and she had asked me to go see him. He was a crossing guard, and he had been hit, run over, and he was seriously ill in the hospital. So I went to see him, and I introduced myself as his daughter's pastor, and she had asked me to come see him. So we were talking, and I felt compelled really to witness to this Catholic man. So I said to him, I said, I said, "Well, it's nice seeing you. I'm glad to see you're getting good care here." And I says, "The most important thing," I says, "is to know that Jesus is your Savior." And he says, "Oh," he said, "Jesus is more than a Savior." So I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And he said, "Oh," he said, "Jesus is my friend."
Mm.
He he said, "I could never get along without Jesus." So I talk to him all the time. And then I sort of relaxed a little bit, and I thought, well, we can have some fellowship here. Instead of me having to convert this guy, we can have some fellowship. And so we're sort of talking back and forth, and I was getting ready to leave. So I said, well, I know your father, your priest, Father Phil from the ministerium. And I said, "I guess you won't be seeing him anytime soon." I said, "I guess it's good to know that you don't have to be in church to pray." And he says, "Nope. He says, all you need is your rosary."
Yes.
And so
Exactly.
I and so that was just another interesting jolt, to me. Right? You think you're on the same level, you're making assumptions, and then you get something like that out of left field, and what's right and what's wrong. Uh, but if you were to ask me, what was it that uh, sort of moved you away from? Because I'm still very, very solidly in the church and part of the church. And
Okay.
well, I as part of my practice, I did a lot of Bible reading. I've read through the Bible completely from cover to cover at least 10 times, and I used to try to read through it every year. And and as I read through the Bible, I got more seriously concerned about certain things I was reading that didn't line up with the theology that I had been taught. I'd say that one of the very first things I was doing some teaching on some Old Testament stories, and creation was one of them. So I was reading through the creation story, and it came to the sixth day. What happened on the sixth day of creation? And as I tried to figure out the timeline for what happened on the sixth day, it says, on the sixth day, God made all the animals that creeped upon the ground.
Mm-hmm.
The birds and the fish were made on the fifth day. But on the sixth day, he made all the other animals. And then he made man, male and female created he them, it says. And then it goes on to say that Adam named all the animals.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no candidate suitable. There was no helpmeet suitable for Adam. So he put him into a deep sleep. So I'm thinking about a timeline now. God made all these animals. Then he made Adam. Then it wasn't suitable for him to be alone. It wasn't good for Adam to be alone, it says. And I thought, well, how long was it going to take to decide that it wasn't good to be alone? That's
right.
More than 5 minutes.
Yes.
Yeah. So he put him into a deep sleep. Well, how long is a deep sleep? And then he makes a woman. And I was thinking, this is way too much for a 24-hour period. This is just unbelievable. And so I started and that was really one of the first stories of the old Bible the whole Bible that I really started to question.
That one trips up a lot of people, Paul. I mean, the first two chapters of Genesis in general, like a lot of people have problems. I think you've touched on something that was important as well, that the difference between theology and what the Bible actually says. There is a difference between those two things, and that can start to rattle people as well.
Yeah. Now there are more scientific reasons to question,
sure,
the Genesis story, but I was never really a real strong intellectual type person, that really understood science or was even that interested really in asking too many questions. If anything, I sort of berate myself for not waking up sooner, or asking more questions along the way. But as I read through the Bible, the character of the Old Testament greats like Noah and David, as I read through about the frustrated, angry God who he regretted that he ever made man, so he flooded the whole world. Those things started to eat away at my confidence in this God that is presented in the scriptures as being the loving God that I could count on and admire. The ark, the size of the ark and the fact that it was supposedly built by one man and three sons with hand tools. And I started thinking about this thing, 450 feet long and 75 feet wide and 45 feet high. And how many trees would that take? And how would you even drag all those trees to the one spot? It's going to take a year just to get the trees down.
Yeah.
You haven't even started the build yet. And as far as getting your sons to help you, I couldn't get my sons to help me wash the car.
Yes, exactly.
And then there's so many verses in the New Testament that I could name that talk about universality of the salvation. There's 10. And as I was reading through the Bible, I started to underline these verses that talk about Christ. He is a ransom for our sins, and not for ours only, but for the sins of the whole world.
Yeah.
And there's just so many there. So those cracks. But then, I went through ordination when I was in the pastorate in this large church. I went through an ordination process, and that also turned out to be a fairly substantial piece of my deconstruction.
Okay.
I was told, that I had a view of hell that was defined by one of the ministers as hell light. They asked me if I believed that the heathen were lost. So I said, this is the council, the ordination council. I said, well, I believe that they are, but I said, I'm not very happy about it.
Yes. Well said. Yes. Okay.
That wasn't good enough for them. They wanted me to be happy about it.
Yeah.
Give glory to God. He's the judge. He's the one that, he's so holy and so worthy of our, that hell is really not, that's all we all deserve, and it's only by his grace. You get that whole picture there. But um, they decided to give me a credential that wasn't ordination. They gave me a license,
Oh, wow.
which,
Okay.
and they kept me on. They didn't fire me from the church. They kept me on. They wanted me to keep working at that point.
How many years of missionary work, how many years of Christian service had you already put in? Like what?
Yeah, and I'd been to seminary. I'd gone to seminary and got a master's degree at a reputable seminary in town, nearby,
Yeah.
that they, liked. Well, I got good grades at seminary.
If you can't be ordained, Paul, no one can. Yeah.
So that was a pretty big hit for me. I kept working there for a number of years, and then my position was eliminated suddenly, very suddenly. And I lost the job that I thought I would never lose.
Mm.
And that was a big blow.
Can I just say I'm sorry? Like
Oh,
I know how vested you must have been, and the grief that you must feel, from that experience. So, I'm sorry you had to go through that.
well, thank you, thank you. As I was standing there in that receiving line on our last Sunday, and the people were coming through, people that I had visited and that I appreciated, that had been friends. One of the common things that they would say to me is, "Well, I'm sure God has something better
Mm.
for you. I'm sure God has something better for you." But that really was not a very helpful comment now as I look back on it. But in fact, it was better for me as I look back now. Not in the way that they thought.
Right. Yes, exactly.
I really feel much freer and much lighter and much wiser
Mm.
now, uh, after being out of that environment. I listened to a lot of podcasts. Greg Boyd uh, was sort of one of my favorite podcasters. He was a Bible teacher, and but he had a different view of things. One of them was the atonement. He didn't believe in the substitutionary atonement theory of the cross. He thought of the cross as being more like healing medicine for the world, rather than that he was actually paying the price to appease an angry God for for sinners. Uh, Another thing, and I'm at the church that uh, there was a lot of people in our church that were gun collectors
Mm.
and very very avid, Second Amendment people,
Okay.
and I just could not ever wrap my head around that. How could God's people uh, think, that guns and Jesus had anything in common?
Yeah.
Uh,
A weapon designed to kill. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And and then reading through the history of the Anabaptist martyrs, the pacifists who were all just wiped out by the thousands because of their pacifism and their wrong theology about baptism. I just thought, that how picky can you get, and how savage can you be to to destroy those people? And then, so as you look back over history of the church and the wars that had been fought, uh, anyway, but I still wasn't quite ready to bail yet,
Okay.
jump. Um, I got a 10-hour a week visitation pastoral job at a United Methodist church in the area, and I felt like I was in a much healthier place with it. There seemed to be more variety of belief and doctrine in that church than where I had been. I started driving a school bus,
Okay.
uh, and my wife refused to go with me to church at that point. And that was a little bit of a bitter pill for me to swallow, because she had been with me all those years, through Africa Then at the Hershey Church, the big church we were at, and she was very, very involved in that church, as she mentioned, in prayer ministry,
Yeah.
and then for her to say, "Look, I'm done. I'm not going to this church with you." That was hard for me, but I appreciated what she had done with me at my side all those years and the cost that she paid. And so, even though it was a difficult pill, I was ready to let it go and let her live her life the way she wanted to. Uh, Even though it stung, that's what happened. But then I got a job driving a tour bus, uh, which took me to many places, interesting places with people vacation. And I was driving in and out of New York City and Washington D.C. and Philadelphia and Florida and up into Niagara Falls and up into Canada. And after 3 years, at first year of driving the tour bus, I was still working at the church, doing visitation 10 hours a week in the cracks. But then it became impossible. Uh, and so then I left church work altogether. And it was for the first time I was free of, after, I don't know, that was February in 2013. After all those years, I was free of being a full-time Christian worker, and I was a secular worker, you know, and I just felt like the burden was off my shoulders. I really did feel free.
That's what I wanted to ask. So at the time when you resigned from the last church position and you were
Mm-hmm.
doing the tour bus, you felt at the time freer, like you had a sense
Yeah,
of like this was a good decision.
yeah, I did. I didn't have any regrets about it. Um, it was thrilling for me to do secular work. I, I finally felt like I had joined humanity.
Mm,
I left behind the spiritual realm of some kind of bondage,
mm,
and was genuinely part of the normal human race and earning a living rather than living by, gifts. I appreciated the gifts, and I never saw it as sort of a bad thing before. But somehow, for me, there was a sense, that I can really appreciate now what it's like to work for your living, really, and you get a paycheck from because of what you produce and what you do and this and the job that you're doing. So I would say that's when I really deconverted. You know, actually I remember driving that school bus and just I was on Grand View Road and I was looking out at a sunrise and across beautiful farmland and I was thinking this is really a great job. You know, now you know really driving a school bus isn't usually seen by most Americans as being a high level position for a guy with a master's degree and
yeah.
pilot's license and aviation background. You drive a school bus. How low can you go? But for me, it was freedom.
Oh, that's amazing. That's that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have one more question really quick before we get too far down like into the present. Again, at the time when you start to say to yourself, I think I'm done. Did you then have conversations again with Deb where did you say, I think I'm where you're at now? What was that like for the two of you?
She knew I was coming along. She was far ahead of me,
Okay.
really, in this whole process. Uh, she was reading mystics. She was reading Richard Rohr. She was reading John Philip Newell, John O'Donohue. Uh, she was reading, Rob Bell. and a host of other people. And she would share stuff with me from those books. She was part of this progressive Christian book club. And I went with her a few times to that. And I liked the people that she was cozying up to, the people that she was associating with. Uh, I thought that those people were interesting. And so she knew that I was, coming along. There wasn't much of a conflict there at all with her. So I was proud of her, really. I was proud of my wife. She had this book club at her house, and one of the ladies that came, they actually did some praying. And when this one lady prayed, she called God instead of calling him God or Lord. She called him the universe. She prayed to the
Mm.
universe. Deb, she told me that, and Deb was kind of interested in that whole concept of where these ladies were. It didn't offend us at all, and in some ways, it sort of opened her eyes to other possibilities.
Right.
So,
Okay.
yeah. So I would say I have a subject here of big takeaways, kind of where I am now. Uh, I I realize that a faithful life of dedication and service to God is not enough for the evangelical church.
Mm.
Uh, you have to say the right words. You have to not say the wrong thing. And then if you do that, if you go along, then you can be approved. But you have to agree with the agenda and the particular leader and whoever that is. You have to
It's
agree.
much more about conformity than about truth.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Another big takeaway is the infinite love and grace of God no longer, for me, has any resemblance to the bigotry and regulations established by the church. It just doesn't. The question of personal relationship. It's interesting that I had a recent conversation with my sister.
Hmm.
My sister. I mentioned about my brother and my sister. My sister's younger, and she's still very, very committed to the traditional Christian view.
Yeah.
She lives in Kansas. I don't hardly ever see her. Um, but she was in town. Her son lives in our town, and so she comes occasionally to see them and the grandkids. And so she came to our house for lunch. I invited her for lunch, and we sat down to the table to eat. And I looked right at her and I said, we don't say grace anymore before meals because I knew that was what was expected. It's going to be expected that I was going to, and I could easily have said grace, you know, and prayed the prayer. But I decided I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to be very, very honest with her.
Yeah.
And so she said, "Oh, she said that's okay." She said, I can say my own grace." She said it kind of with a smile, not in an antagonistic
Sure.
way.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
No, I can say my own grace. I said, "Yeah, that's great." But she said, "No." But since you brought this up, she said, since you were honest with me, she said, let me just ask you. She said, what caused you to stop saying grace? And I didn't give my best answer to that question to her at the time. I should have been ready for it, but um, I said there's a lot of things that we were taught growing up that I don't believe anymore, and I said I can no longer believe, in a heaven that's up in the sky and hell that's down in the earth. Um, and so I said, grace is just one of those things that we no longer feel compelled to do. I mean, I thought later I could have said, I'm thankful for my clothes. Every morning I get dressed, but I don't stop to pray
Right.
and
Right.
I'm thankful for my car.
Yeah.
Before I get in the car, I don't stop and say, and I don't think God needs to constantly be patted on the back. That's not the kind of God that I envision him to be or here. or it? I could have given that kind of an answer, which would have been more direct to answer her question, why don't you say grace?
We say this a lot on the podcast that as Christians, we were expected to have an answer at all times, to be prepared, right? And I like to say to people in the process of deconstruction or at the end of it, wherever you're at, you don't have to have an answer. And just because you don't have a complete, sophisticated, nuanced answer to someone's question doesn't mean that you're not in a valid place with a valid opinion, right? And
Right.
so there's just that juxtaposition of what the expectations are and what we bring with us. It feels like, oh, I should have said that better. It's okay.
That's a that's a great point. That is very a great point. You kind of implied in talking to my wife at the table there. Uh, she she kind of implied that we must never have had a personal relationship with Jesus, uh, because in her mind, if you ever did have that, you would never give it up. And and so she was kind of implying that, well, I know that you were missionaries and pastor and everything, but maybe you just never really, it was never real for you. You never really had a personal relationship. And my wife took pretty strong offense to
Sure.
that,
Yeah.
saying, I did have a relationship with Jesus. I did prayer ministry, in church for many years, and it was real for me, and so I started thinking about personal relationship.
Okay.
How did I measure my personal relationship with Jesus? And as I thought about it, I thought, well, it's when I would be visiting somebody in the hospital, and I would open my Bible to a certain place, and suddenly there's the perfect verse, or some thought would come to me that would be just so, and it would surprise me almost.
Hmm.
How did I ever come up with that? Or where did that come from? That and just seems so. I would attribute that to God.
Hmm.
Well, God put that in my mind. He's leading me. He's leading me in and out of these rooms, and that's an indication of my relationship with God and with the Lord. And before I would fly in Africa on all my flights, I would I would pray.
Hmm.
And I prayed with my passengers, whether they were, Christian people or not. Most of them were. Most of them were missionary people. But sometimes they were, we did charters.
Sure.
We did government flights. We flew for the embassy. Uh, and I would say to the passengers, I'd say, well, look, I know I believe in the Lord, and I always pray before I take off. So, if you don't mind, I'd like to do that now. And I said a prayer right out loud, and then, some of the flights, most of the flights, were pretty routine, but some weren't. I had some problems. I had weather problems. I had plane problems. Sometimes the plane didn't function properly, and sometimes there was, I had some pretty harried some stories, but all the landings were safe. I never had a crash,
Yeah.
and so how my relationship with Jesus? Well, I thought, well, he's watching over me. I talked to him this morning. And I was never one that was good at meditating. For a while there, I was trying to do centering prayer where I would sit and I'd set an alarm clock for 10 minutes. And I would sit there and try to just and concentrate on a tree branch or something out the window and open my mind up for the Lord to speak to me. I was never very good at that. But I went through those, and that's how I measured my relationship with Jesus. And so for me, it was as real as that. Now I realize now, through my reading and my life experience that people meditate and people pray that are not Christians, in all different religions, and have those same similar experiences. But uh, you know, I don't know how much more real it could have been than than what it was.
Well, I don't doubt you in any way. I know that this is so common, Paul, that the remaining believers in our lives, when we talk about the deconstruction we've gone through, inevitably it's a defense mechanism to say, well, it's the no true Scotsman. You could not possibly have been a real
Yeah,
Christian. You could not have had the kind of relationship that I have with Jesus, and it's just it's a response, right? There's no way, there's no arguing with that. And so
yeah,
I think it's ironic that we often find ourselves in the position of trying to defend our former faith, to say, no,
yeah,
you don't understand. I really
yeah.
did believe. I deeply believed. It's a wild, wild ride.
It really is. It really is. Well, some of the books that I've read that have been meaningful to me as far as resources and
Yeah.
uh, How the Bible Actually Works by Peter Enns was very helpful. Leaving Church, a Memoir of Faith by Barbara Brown Taylor. That was another excellent book. Holy Envy, Finding God in the Faith of Others by Barbara Brown Taylor. That was an excellent resource. I just could hardly stop reading that book. Crazy for God by Frank Schaeffer. The End of White Christian America by Robert P. Jones. White Too Long by Robert P. Jones. Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes Dumez. And really, the one that I've read most recently that has really helped me in my journey is Unbelievable by John Shelby Spong.
Okay.
That it was his last book before he died, not too long ago. And so, uh, as I think back, I know I carry some guilt as from having benefited from the religious subculture
Mm.
into which I was born. I benefited by having a multifaceted, international, exotic career and life that brought me a lot of satisfaction. My benefactors, they did it all. The ones that financed our lives and prayed for us and wrote letters and welcomed us in and out of their homes. They did it all because of their evangelistic fervor. They believed in the cause that we were so involved with, a cause that I now no longer believe in.
Yeah.
It was I don't regret the lives that Deb and I have lived and the life we had. I don't but um, I don't I know I wouldn't if I had to do it all over again. I wouldn't be there.
For sure, Paul. I do want to just say again that this is very, very common, that we experience a sense of guilt, and that guilt is only because hindsight is 2020, right?
Yeah,
Like, just like you said, if you had to do it over again with the information you have now, you wouldn't. But at the time, you didn't have that information,
right.
right? We were all inside a bubble, and everyone around us was inside a bubble, and we did the best that we could with the information we had at the time.
And we came out of a certain context,
Yeah.
and everybody does.
Yes.
Everybody comes out of a different context, and how that forms us is it. There's no debating it. You know, Most people born, in America, come with this Christian thing, unless they're from, some other country, an African country or, a Middle Eastern country. They may be Muslims, or if they're Indians, they probably are Hindus. Uh, you know, or it's just the way it is. It's the way it works.
Yeah.
So to think that you can reason your way out easily
Yeah.
uh, is not true.
Exactly. I agree. Yeah. Yeah.
So another conversation I had recently was with our oldest son. Our kids, by the way, are all they're proud of us.
Okay.
Uh, they're
Yeah. Yeah. That's
very, very
amazing. That's awesome.
yeah, they're all proud of us. They're all super young adults, and we're proud of them too. Very proud. Our oldest son recently, I gave him the book, John Shelby Spong's book, and he was reading it, and he commented on the idea of an afterlife. John Shelby Spong still believes in Christianity, but with different definitions.
Right.
And he calls himself a Christian, and he believes, in an afterlife. And Nate says the idea of an afterlife is really for our son. He says it's irrelevant. He said because there is really no afterlife. He says we have nothing but the present. Everything that exists was in the past, and the present, and the future is all in the present. And he says if you understand time and the way it works, and the relativity of speed and time, and there's and that. Now, I'm not smart enough to understand that concept and to debate it,
Sure.
but it interests me, and it's interesting. He said to me when he heard I was going to have this interview, he said, don't talk so much about what you don't believe anymore, but talk about what you do believe. That was kind of his advice to me, and I started thinking about, well, if I'm telling my story, as far as what I do believe, it's much more difficult because I have more questions now, really, than answers. I'm not even sure what I believe. I'm pretty sure I know what I don't believe.
Right.
As far as being able to explain what I do believe,
Yeah.
I know that God is way bigger than I ever thought of it. Him or her or it or whatever that is, it's much bigger. It includes all of nature. John Shelby Spong, he says it like this. He says God is the source. For him, God is the source of life, and he's the source of love, and he's the ground of all being.
Mm-hmm.
So he said we should live fully. That's the way to honor God. Live fully. We should love wastefully.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
We should not love with conditions. Conditions, based on who a person is, who they love, what their job is, what their ethnic background is. We should love wastefully, and we should be all that we can be. God is the ground of being. God is the source of everything that exists, all nature, every single thing. And if you think about the way the Bible talks about God, that's kind of what the theology is that we were taught from the very beginning. That God is everywhere. God is in everything. In him we live and move and have our being.
Mm.
The Bible says. Well, what does that mean? In him we live and move and have our being. Well, God is in every person. God is in every tree. He's in every plant. He's in every animal. So that theology is in the Bible if you see it that way. But if you restrict yourself to the creeds, that were put together, in 300 and 400 AD, and you follow that restricted, rigid structure that has been placed onto Christianity, well, then I think you have a pretty small idea of how it all fits. So that's kind of where I'm landing as far as what I do believe.
Okay.
Now, we go to a Unitarian church, which is very interested in social programs and in being inclusive and loving everyone. And that works for us. That works for us now.
Excellent. I do just want to say that, often what we're trying to say with the podcast is that a lot of what you just described, you can get just within humanity and nature without needing a metaphysical leap of any kind. Right. And now I'm not asking you to do that necessarily, but I just want to state it out loud that it's okay also to not have anything and still find
Absolutely.
community and joy. And, I like to say it this way, that the false dichotomy of theism versus nihilism is false, right? You can be a humanist, you can be a naturalist, and still have all of these wonderful things as well.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I've landed. Uh, I said to my sister at the table, I said, we no longer we're not trying to convince you to join us in our spiritual journey. We don't feel called now to change anybody's mind about anything. Everybody has to decide how they're going to live their lives and what's going to be important to them and what their priorities are going to be, and however they choose to do that is fine with me. And one of my best friends at the Unitarian Church is an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't believe in God at all. He's and he's very outspoken about that with me, and we appreciate each other. And I realize, as even John Shelby Spong, who I quoted, he said, I have to admit, he said, I might be deluded, in my belief about but he said that's a possibility for me. And I don't hold firmly to my most recent conclusions. I think probably we're all still wrong, in the way whatever conclusion we come to, we're just looking for a way to live and love people and be agreeable and be wise. So
excellent. I don't think we could have said it any better than that. So, Paul, thank you so much for being on the podcast and sharing your story.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciated the chance to say it.
Final thoughts on the episode. I'm going to be relatively brief here as I am trying to get this episode out and under time duress, so my apologies for not being as thorough. But Paul's story is absolutely amazing. My heart breaks for him not getting the ordination, being rejected by the church, being ultimately let go. I can't imagine what that must have felt like after so many years of service. As I've said a few times before, I think the Duns, people who have lived out their lives within the faith tradition and then subsequently deconstruct, are just really powerful stories. And so I think Paul is definitely an example of that. I'm also really happy to hear that Deb and Paul's family support them and were on their side when Paul was let go from the church. I think family is really important, and I'm glad to hear that. I want to thank Paul for being on the podcast, for sharing his story with us, all of that wisdom of experience, helping people, loving people, all of that still counts. And I imagine that he continues to do so today. Thank you, Paul, for being on the podcast. The Secular Grace Thought of the Week, I can't help but say this again. I mentioned this in Ruby's episode a few episodes back. We've had a number of guests who are in the middle of deconstruction. They still have some form of faith, and the amount of work that they are describing going through is heartbreaking. And I try not to proselytize about humanism, but I just want to say again that it is okay to have a standard of evidence and to say, if something doesn't meet this standard of evidence, I don't accept it as true. For me personally, that's all deconversion was, is my standard of evidence rose a little bit, not even all that much. And a number of things fell through. The reason that I'm an atheist is a response to that, not the cause of that. And the reason I'm a humanist is that I think that we can love people without having to have a belief system attached to that. And that's what I call secular grace. We can love people without the baggage, and we can accept ourselves for who we are. And we do not need to hold on to the belief in anything that doesn't meet a certain standard of evidence. And there is real rest and real peace in that. Next week, we have Bob Barnes talking about the Blue Water Atheists, Humanists, and Agnostics Conference in Ontario, Canada on August 26th through the 28th. Bob is going to tell us all about the conference and how you can show up and be a part of it. Soon we will have another episode with Arlene in the hosting chair. That's upcoming soon. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google deconversion, you can Google secular grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.